My guest today is an expert on the poison path. We've had a previous chat about baneful herbs, their entheogenic properties, and how you might use them to make something like flying ointment. But today he'll be returning to M3 to discuss his latest book, the Poison Path Grimoire. We're going to take a look at plants from a slightly different perspective, just as poisons. And we'll talk about how that might relate to things on a spiritual level, like to alchemy or to death of the ego. Allow me to introduce Coby Michael. Welcome to Music, Myth, and Magic. I'm Eric Arcadian, and today I'm speaking to author and returning guest, Coby Michael. Coby, thanks so much for coming back on the show with me today.
Yeah, excited to be back. Had a great time last time.
Well, it's an honor to have you back. And it has been, I want to say it's probably been about a year and a half since we last spoke back in season 1. So since then, what have you been up to?
Oh gosh, that feels like 100 years ago at least.
Yeah, I know.
I came out with the second book, the Poison Path Grimoire, that we're going to be talking about today. I've zigzagged across the country doing different classes, workshops, markets, filled a whole lot of little bottles and put a lot of little stickers on them.
So one thing that I know that you've been big into each year, and I do know a little bit about it because you let me present there, is the Botanica Obscura conference. So can you talk a little bit about that before we get into the book?
Yeah, it's every year in March. Botanica Obscura conference is a completely online virtual event specializing in esoteric herbalism, plant magic, plant medicine. So we've got presenters from all over the world, from a variety of different backgrounds, different traditions, all kind of giving their own perspectives and personal practices when it comes to working with plants and herbs and fungi in a spiritual context. So we're actually going to be opening up the submissions for our 5th year at the beginning of August.
Very cool. I think it is a unique conference. There are a lot of people gathering there that talk about just topics really in depth that I had never thought of, never heard of. So it's definitely a really fascinating group of people and collection of workshops. So I'll post that link in the video description if anybody's looking out for it, so you can learn more about that. So let's talk about your newest book, the sequel to the Poison Path Herbal. We've got the Poison Path Grimoire now. And Coby, before we get into the book's contents, I'm kind of curious about the cover. You know, I love the cover of your first book, really dig the kind of dark vibe of the cover on your second. And I am wondering if you could explain the symbol on the front that's kind of covered in these plants.
Yeah. So that is basically a sigil that is also my business logo. So you can see it kind of gets warped when I twist my arm. But so it's basically, I took the word poisoner's apothecary and then used just a basic like sigil making technique to break it all down and put it all back together to make a little design. So that kind of represents the spirit, the energy, the current of all of the work that I do. So it gets put on all kinds of things. The particular artwork on the front cover of this book is a little bit fancier than the glyph on the Poison Path Herbal, and that was actually done by artist Scarlett Loring.
Very nice. Well, it's a beautiful cover. You had some great art done for you there. So I am curious what the journey has been like for you in between writing the Poison Path Herbal and writing the Poison Path Grimoire.
Well, gosh, the Poison Path Herbal, I started putting that together back in like 2018, and it took a lot longer, I guess, for all of that to kind of come together and come out by the time it was fully realized. So I feel like in the timeline, there was a pretty big gap in between the first book and the second book. And I feel like in the first book, I was really still kind of in like my own learning process, information gathering. It's like a lot of data, a lot of historical stuff, a lot of practical information. And then the grimoire is a little bit more on the esoteric side of things, incorporating more spell work, more ritual, sort of more like metaphysical philosophy when it comes to the poison path. Also kind of represents sort of my own journey. So the Poison Path Herbal came out in 2021, and I had just moved down to Florida a few months before that. And that really kind of kick-started this incubation process where I really started to be able to just like unpack and work on things that have happened throughout my lifetime that I needed to, I guess, kind of sit with. So it was a pretty difficult kind of transition period. Lots of shadow work, lots of different individuals and life experiences kind of coming into my sphere that were bringing up all of these different things that I guess I needed to look at. So the Poison Path Grimoire, I feel like, is a little bit darker in some senses, and that sort of reflects the place that I was in at the time that I was writing it and when it all kind of came together. So, I've always bounced back and forth between light and dark and tried to like reflect and embody both. So this is more on the darker end of the spectrum.
Now, that's an interesting thing that you bring up, because you do talk about that balance between light and dark in the book. And I think a very important mention is that when we're talking about things like light and dark, we're not referring to qualities like good or evil. Mm-hmm. And you in fact, you brought up this workshop by Ivo Dominguez Jr., where he said something like, sometimes we just need to accept the thing for what it is. So when you talk about the dark side of things, what are you referring to?
They're typically things that are hidden or a little bit more mysterious, not necessarily how they present themselves at face value. Things that take a little bit more digging to kind of get to the root of. When it comes to spirits, deities, various different entities, like Evo mentions, they are typically beings that are very primal and vast and kind of represent energies that are, a lot larger than what we're able to comprehend, or different themes that are, a little bit uncomfortable for us, or things that we can't, fully understand at this point in our incarnation. So things like death. There's no moral compass or whatever kind of attached to that concept. It's just something that happens. But because of where we're at right now and our perspective on that as being like living beings, it kind of takes on this darker, or in some cases more negative connotation, because we just simply can't understand it at this current moment.
That is an interesting concept, and I believe you have a whole class of herbs. You came up with a word for them. They're like plants related to death. It was something chthonic. I can't remember what.
Chthonigens.
Yes, there you go. Okay, so I think I would like to bring that up in a few minutes, but first I kind of want to touch on the topic of poisons, because that's like there's a very primary drive for what's in this book, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because in your first book, you do talk about poisons, you talk about poisonous, baneful herbs, but the feeling that I get from the first book is that there's more of an approach to them for their medicinal or entheogenic properties, and not necessarily just for the poison aspect of things. So what is it like to approach something just as a poison?
So poison was initially my interest in working with these plants and the poison path in general. It wasn't so much their medicinal properties and poison as medicine and poison in the dose and all of those things that, get echoed on the poison path community. Wasn't super interested in their entheogenic effects at first. I was just interested in the fact that they were poisonous, they were deadly, they were dangerous. They were, very dramatic when it came to the different stories associated with their use. So it's really kind of become an exploration and investigation of the concept of poison and what that means, the different ways that it's used to express all sorts of different things, not just like physical poison and things that are potentially harmful or lethal, but also as kind of like a metaphor for people and for energies and for behaviors as far as different things being toxic or, just the variety of different ways that poison is kind of understood, and looking at that throughout history. Also in different languages and the different kind of connotations that has, and how poison doesn't necessarily ultimately translate into something that equates to death, but it really represents this very wide spectrum of things. So poison, in its most general terms, is something with potency. It's something with the ability to transform, to really cause a dramatic shift and dramatic change, whether that is positive or negative for the thing that it's causing that change for. So really starting to kind of understand it as this very like human, culturally dependent, historically dependent kind of a concept that like really, nothing is poison, but everything is poison. And, just looking at it more as sort of this abstract concept that gets applied to different things. So in a sense, it's very much its own kind of an energy that is expressed by certain plants and fungi and people and places that sort of have this poisonous aura about them. So beginning to really kind of like tap into that and start to understand what that actually means and how that can be applied to spiritual growth, personal healing, inner alchemy, magical practice.
Well, that's certainly interesting. And I love the spectrum that things exist on. And you have poison on one side of the spectrum and healing over on the other. And then you have the mentality that if you can heal, you can curse, or if you can heal, you can poison, or that one man's poison is the other man's medicine, right? So is there a practical example that you can think of something that acts both as a poison or as a medicine, depending on the quantity?
Oh gosh, a lot of different things. Like the the first thing that comes to mind is like pharmaceutical painkillers.
Yeah, certainly.
They're very effective and necessary for a lot of people and in certain contexts, but then in other contexts they can be very detrimental, very harmful. But to, I guess, think of them as healing, they're not so much healing the source of pain as they are, kind of covering it up. So that might not be, the best example, but all of the herbal medicines out there are very much like contextual and dose dependent, depending on the individual's circumstances, their own body chemistry. What is healing and beneficial to one person can be very dangerous and harmful for another. So like foxglove, for example, the digitalin in the foxglove is used to treat cardiac arrest and edema related to cardiac arrest. But if the person doesn't have those symptoms, then it does basically the opposite thing and can basically stop your heart.
That's a good one. That's fascinating. Wow. Okay, so in the book, you talk a lot about the inherent connection between poison and witchcraft. So what connection is there?
Oh, well, that goes back to, poison equating to potency and the ability that these plants have to cause very dramatic changes and shifts. And, that's essentially what we're doing when we practice witchcraft. And poison is kind of demonized and misunderstood because of its potency, because of the potential that it has to cause harm through lack of understanding or, intentionally trying to cause that harm. Witchcraft kind of has suffered the same fate, sort of that demonization through lack of understanding, and sort of become a collective for all of these negative societal things. So poison and witchcraft are very, very synonymous, especially when we look through history, that a lot of times the people that were accused of witchcraft were oftentimes accused of poisoning, to the point where the words maleficium and beneficium, essentially mean very similar things.
Okay, so you used the word misunderstood. And anytime that someone says something is misunderstood, I wonder, well, how do we properly understand it? So what is like some very practical or approachable ways that someone could work towards better understanding the nature of poisons?
I think it comes down to individual experience. So starting to explore these plants, researching their history, ways that they've been used beneficially, ways that they've been used intentionally to cause harm, looking at their medicinal properties, their chemical action, and kind of realizing that they all need to be approached on an individual basis. Poison gets applied to so many different plants that have so many different chemical actions, and they can poison you in a lot of different ways. Some of them stop your heart, some of them paralyze your respiratory system, some of them completely disrupt cell metabolism on a microscopic level. So there's all sorts of different ways that plants can be poisonous. So approaching them on an individual basis, and also kind of having those firsthand experiences where you're coming into contact with these plants and their spirits through, growing the physical plant, working with formulas containing the plant material, handling the plant material, and, kind of becoming aware of sort of our dramatic response to the idea of poison. People kind of, and no fault of their own, treat poisonous plants like they are radioactive, or that they're going to like actively hop out of their pots and come like stab you in the night. But it's a much more passive thing with poison, that these are just compounds that exist in the plant to, prevent different diseases, prevent pathogenic bacteria, fungi, herbivores from consuming the plants. They're not like actively weaponizing these compounds that exist in them. So poison is a little bit different than venom, where we see venom is what is present in snakes and toads and scorpions and bees, and kind of takes a more active, offensive direction than what's present in plants. So kind of that firsthand experience and realizing that poison doesn't ultimately lead to our complete and utter destruction.
That's a really interesting observation about poison not being like a weapon or offensive, as opposed to venom, which can be. That's fascinating. I never thought about that before. So you say that people should approach this on an individual level, and in the book you say that the poison path itself is very individualistic. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, do you feel that most of the information that people are gaining from poisonous plants right now is really kind of like a personal gnosis?
Yeah, I think so. It is highly individualistic. And even, calling it the poison path, which is not my term, kind of makes it sound like it's its own tradition, or that's like this specific set of beliefs, which is totally not the case. When we look at it on a global scale, it really spans across cultures and time periods, and encompasses all of these different plants, fungi, cacti, even some like animal sources of different poisons that have entheogenic uses. So in certain parts of the world where there is kind of this unbroken chain of indigenous plant wisdom, and people working with very chemically potent plants that have, from a European perspective, been associated with being poisonous and diabolical and all of these negative things. It's very much kind of touching on those concepts of the same kind of like demonization and misunderstanding that happened within like a context of European witchcraft. And for me, that has kind of been like my main focus, is looking at plants from that part of the world and kind of trying to sort of piece together, not a tradition, but just sort of a way of working with, chemically potent plants and fungi in a spiritual context, because it doesn't really exist in like the modern witchcraft revival. I think that there was sort of a big effort to either ignore or kind of suppress that aspect of things in favor of other methods of accessing the spiritual realm. So yes, it's very individualistic. I think in a lot of ways, when it comes to many of these plants, we're kind of reverse engineering or remembering the different ways that we can work with them sort of through our own personal gnosis. And I think, years down the road, we will have more of a, like a concrete kind of, I hate to use the word tradition, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. It's really interesting because right now, and it's not the first time that we're discovering it as humans, certainly, but like, as you mentioned, it seems like some of it was kind of intentionally left out or obscured. And so it seems like almost we're on the edge of rediscovering some of these things, which is really cool. It's really exciting. And I'm going to ask you about entheogens again, or I'm going to bring it up again. Okay. And if for anybody watching, if you don't know what an entheogen is, I suggest that you go back to season 1 and listen to Coby's first interview, and I'll link it in the corner, or he gives some really great info on entheogens. And I'm wondering, Coby, if we have a plant or an herb and it has both baneful qualities and it has entheogenic qualities, is there a different mentality that goes into approaching it on an entheogenic level versus on a poisonous level?
I think just the understanding that it does have that baneful side to it and that potential for poisoning, that it is going to connect us to spirits and realms and experiences that kind of reflect that. And that's where the chthonigen term kind of comes in that I feel that a lot of the plants associated with the poison path, particularly plants in the nightshade family, have this very chthonogenic quality, meaning that they are associated with the underworld. So entheogen is essentially any plant or fungi or preparation that has psychoactive properties that's used in a ritual, ceremonial context to connect with the spirit realm. Some of those are a little bit more celestially oriented in the energies that they connect to, and others are more oriented to the underworld, to the shadow, to the realm of the ancestors. So it's all spirit flight. It's all entheogenic experience, but just going into different directions, connecting with different energies. And I feel that, as plant medicine practitioners, different people resonate more with one or the other, or in some cases, both. So we've got all of these different allies that help us to kind of get to access those places.
It's very interesting. I find the recurring themes and mention of death to be really, really quite fascinating, and not just on a physical level, but on a metaphoric level. So, for instance, I'm curious, like when we talk about the act of self-poisoning. Now, not suggesting anyone go out and poison themselves, of course, right? But even if we're just dealing with it on a symbolic level, like as you mentioned in the book, floating a poisonous flower in a chalice or something like that, letting the spirits know that you're willing to tempt fate or, test the waters with it, right? So this is reflective of death, but not just physical death, also death of the ego, which is a theme that is out there in so many initiatory traditions. So is that act of symbolic self-poisoning in a way some type of initiation into this type of path in general? If so, what are you being initiated to?
Yeah, it's definitely an initiation. It is a transgressive act, something that kind of goes against our survival instincts. So it definitely causes a shift in consciousness, but it also creates an energetic and spiritual shift around us that kind of creates this liminal space that we're able to access different energies, whether it's to incorporate into a specific ritual, or to kind of direct into kind of our own personal journey of healing and transformation. I I have a difficult time with the whole ego death thing. I guess most of us do. So I don't think it's so much about like the ego being this bad thing, or, the different qualities and experiences and desires and all of the things that sort of make up like who we are in this current lifetime are like this bad thing that we need to, like destroy, or, be completely unattached to, or whatever. That just all seems a little bit pointless to me. And, maybe that's why I am more of a left-hand path practitioner, that it is, we're here for a reason. We are who we are for a reason. To systematically try and erase that it just doesn't really lead anywhere and seem that productive. So, what would the point be in the first place? So, kind of experiencing this lifetime through the perspective of this current, manifestation of our consciousness that we call the ego, and fully experiencing it, the good and the bad and the pleasure and the pain. And I feel like working with poisonous plants helps us to kind of tap into that in a way that is empowering. And I think that has a lot to do with, or kind of reflects the shadow work that I do, and that it's not so much like integrating or banishing these like broken and sad and angry and unwanted parts of ourselves, but really like understanding the root of all of that, and turning those darker aspects into allies, really understanding who we are and how we navigate the world and what we want from it, and not letting ourselves feel the shame and the fear and the lack of confidence when it comes to different aspects of ourselves. Because to me, that is the real shadow, kind of that diminishing voice. Not so much the more, physically linked things that we feel guilty about when it comes to our physical experience here.
This is a really interesting take on ego, and kind of just jumping back to the theme that we were talking about in the beginning of the conversation, which is things aren't necessarily like good or evil. They just are what they are. Accept them for what they are. And it's kind of can be that way with the ego too, right? It's there. It has a purpose. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, even though a lot of people look upon it as something that's bad or negative. So maybe we just accept it for what it is. It has a purpose at certain times. And at other times, maybe it's just better that, we put it in a little box and put it away at certain times, right? So that's interesting. And man, there's so many different things that I want to ask you about here. But let's start with this. A lot of what you talk about is shadow work. And a lot of what you talk about in the book with poisonous plants is also shadow work. So is there a simple example of some type of practical ways that you could give that people could embrace the poisonous side of plants with a little bit of shadow work?
So each book seems to kind of come together on its own, and it has sort of a theme running through it that's not necessarily, a pre-thought out thing that I came up with beforehand, but it just kind of like manifests how it manifests. And then once it's all together in physical form, it's really interesting to see what that winds up being. And that kind of wound up being more or less the main theme of this second book. And I know that like shadow work has been super trendy for a number of years, and like there's a lot of different takes on it and all of that. But that's what it was. That's how it came out. And so we're just going with that. But I kind of consider working with poisonous plants in general, kind of a collective shadow work when it comes to just our perspectives, our perceptions, our understanding when it comes to our connection to the natural realm, and back to just really like understanding the plants as individuals. We always talk about like the baneful qualities and the poison path and the dark herbalism and all of that, which is very interesting, and definitely resonate with that more I guess kind of rebellious side of things. But wrapped up in that are these very profound healing properties and abilities and lessons that these plants have to teach us. So a lot of our most profound and transformational experiences happen in dark periods. They happen in the shadow. They happen, when we're alone, when we're in a not a great place. So talking about like the light and the dark balance, within the darkness is like this bright little light that comes out, and they're like, hey, we actually want to help. Like, we're really cool and we're really edgy and we've got all of this really like witchy, awesome folklore. But also we can help you with all of this stuff too. So that's been pretty cool to realize. I have like a very warm, fuzzy spot in my heart for poisonous plants, because they do have that. They're kind of the underdogs of the plant world that, are actually very, very willing and capable of helping us. So like, for example, foxglove. Very powerful for heart healing, any kind of like emotional work, heartbreak, grief, different things like that. It's like super, super duper supportive for, in a really, warm, loving kind of a way. And then when we look at it on chemical level, like I mentioned, it has the potential to stop your heart. So it does have this capability to be harmful and dangerous, but on an energetic kind of spiritual level, it's extremely supportive and loving and, just a great guy.
Okay, so if that was the theme that you felt kind of weaved itself through the second book, do you have an idea of what the theme was that weaved itself through the first?
So when I wrote the first book, I kind of like came up with this system of categorization or like pattern that I was noticing, and I called it the 3 ways of the poison path, which is kind of part of where like the triangle and the glyph comes from. And it was basically these 3 main qualities that I kind of noticed manifesting, running through all of the plants of the poison path, or at least the kind of the main focuses of work that we were looking at when it came to them. And that was Saturn, Venus, and Mercury. So it's kind of looking like those are reflected also in the 3, soon to be 3 books. So the first book I put in the Saturnian category. The second book I have representing Venus, because there is a lot of Venusian magic as far as like aphrodisiac formulas. I look at the shadow work and the inner healing, the heart healing as kind of being a Venusian thing. And then the third one that's not out yet is looking like it's representing Mercury. And those were sort of the 3 main categories that I noticed.
Man, as soon as you brought that up with having the Saturnian the Venus energy, the Mercury energy. I knew exactly where you were going with that. It almost seems like you had designed this from the beginning, like you had a plan to write these 3 very specific books. Did you have any idea that, when you were writing the first one, that there was going to be a second or a third?
No, none whatsoever. I mean, I knew that I would write more books, but I didn't know like what about or have any kind of a plan for that. So it's almost like future me had already written the books and then was like kind of coming back and whispering to present me.
That's really cool. Okay, since we're on the topic, what is that next book going to be about?
The next one is called the Poison Path Oracle. It is a book. It's not an oracle deck. That's coming soon too. So the Poison Path Oracle is focused on divination, spirit communication, and trance work. So just like it sounds, incorporating poisonous plants into divinatory practice, using them to communicate with spirits. I include a lot of folklore kind of focused on those specific uses, different types of divination, also cover poisonous plant and tarot card associations, poison plant rune associations. So just using like these different symbol sets that are already existing to kind of come to a deeper understanding for the specific energies of the plants that are in the book. There's a section on psychic poisons, protecting against them and using them. So super excited for that one. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay. I have to ask, how are you connecting poisonous plants and runes, for instance?
Oh, I guess I've been just immersed in the Poison Path world for such a long time that I just feel kind of like plugged in to the specific energies that each plant kind of contains within itself. And so I'm able to make these kind of abstract associations to other things. And I feel like that gives us a deeper understanding of the plants. But then on the other hand, it kind of gives us a deeper understanding of whatever the divinatory modality is too. So taking into consideration like all of their magical correspondences, elemental correspondences, associations with different deities and spirits, and kind of finding the rune or the tarot card that it matches up with the best.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, and I say this all the time, I love correspondence lists. I love reading correspondence lists and just looking at the different ways that things can connect together, because on a magical level, that makes, or at least has the potential to make things more powerful when you can embrace those correspondences and apply them. So that's really interesting. And I think I'm gonna ask you, this might seem like a random series of questions, okay? But I want to ask you about connections between poison and XYZ. Okay, so there is a theme of alchemy that you mentioned several times. You brought it up a couple times during this conversation as well. So where does poison fit in the alchemical cosmology?
Poison fits with the Nigredo stage of putrefaction. So the blackening, the breaking down, the dissolution. So on like an organic cellular level, when we are poisoned, there's essentially like a breakdown or a disruption of, whatever process that poison is affecting. So it correlates to that, and that kind of represents the ego death that we love to talk about so much, just sort of like breaking down all of the pieces of ourselves and then, putting them back together in a new way.
Yeah. So, right. In Jungian terms, we might say that poison is the thing that brings on the dark night of the soul.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very interesting. Okay. So that's connection number one. The other thing I want to hear you talk about is the connection between poisons and aphrodisiacs.
Yeah. So poisons are aphrodisiacs in a lot of a lot of cases. The aphrodisiacs, the love potions, are kind of like the original poisons too. So we think about like arousal and influence and intoxication all being forms of like self-poisoning in a positive way. Kind of in the modern context, we understand sort of more so from the poisonous perspective of them being, dangerous herbs that aren't really used super often in medicinal herbalism. But we go back to earlier in their history and looking at all of these different parts of the world, that a lot of these plants were used for their aphrodisiac properties, especially plants in the nightshade family. So people were consuming them in all sorts of different ways to lower inhibitions, to become intoxicated, to become aroused. So they have a very extensive history as far as their aphrodisiac uses, and a lot of the criminal record or court proceedings when it came to different cases of poisoning had to do with people that were using aphrodisiacs that accidentally poison people, either killing them or driving them mad, or getting into some kind of trouble through these more like recreational aphrodisiac preparations that contained, poisonous plants, poisonous insects, animals.
So there's a lot of Venus energy in the aphrodisiacs. And then, like you mentioned in the first book, you do have the triangle with Saturn, Venus, and Mercury. So those are definitely some aspects of deity that could be appealed to when approaching plants. But with poisons specifically, do you have any other deities that you usually work with in regard to that?
Not really, to be perfectly honest. There are certain deities that I resonate with sort of in my own personal practice, just through like an ancestral perspective. But I very much consider myself a plant-based practitioner. Plant spirits, land spirits, those are kind of the main spirits that I work with. I don't really have like a big devotional practice when it comes to deities. But there are deities that I mention in the books, just kind of in my writing or teaching when I'm speaking to other practitioners, that I sort of feel like they kind of reflect important concepts or important aspects when it comes to the poison path. So just kind of using them almost more as like literary tools to communicate a specific energy or a specific association. But there are no official like patron deities of the poison path.
Is there a patron deity of poison or baneful herbs or anything like that?
We could make a case for Hecate. Definitely kind of the poster child of poisonous plants that, probably played some role in teaching figures like Medea and Circe, with their kind of association to that Hecatean current. Then there's in Hindu mythology, Shiva is considered the god of poison, but he's also the god of intoxication, ecstasy, yoga, other various things. So there are different deities that kind of have a poison connection, but I don't think one that's necessarily like the deity of poisons.
I get that. Okay. Very cool. Well, Coby, in just a minute, I am going to ask you the signature question version 2, because I already asked you the signature question the first time around. And if anybody would like to hear that, I will again refer you to season 1, episode 5. But before I get to that, I just want to give you a minute to let people know where they can find you, both online and in person, coming up here.
Sure. So you can visit my website, thepoisonersapothecary.com. That's where my blog and all of my products and announcements wind up. You can also follow me on social media at Poisoners Apothecary, or just look me up, Coby Michael. Coming up in the future, I'll be presenting at Salem Witch Fest on August 19th online, so anybody can view that presentation. That one is called Malice, Venom of the Witch, and it's a little bit different of a focus, kind of getting away from the plants and going more into astrological magic when it comes to calling down and cultivating and directing celestial venoms, through our own innate ability as witches to kind of tap into and hone that very unique energy. Then in September, I'll be at Phoenix Fire Festival here in Florida, which is a 4-day outdoor camping magic sort of situation.
And the new site for Phoenix is delightful. It is a beautiful, beautiful campsite. So I will take all of those links, Coby, and they will be posted in the video description below. So if anybody's looking for further information, all you have to do is click. There'll be a link to the books down there as well. All right. So, Coby, signature question, version 2. What's your favorite musical memory?
I would say, I don't know, it might even be like kind of cliche, but I was in band in middle school. I stopped in high school, so I didn't make it that far. I had found other more important recreational things to do after school. But I really enjoyed being in band. I played the alto saxophone, and then I switched to drums or percussion. So I played all of the hitting instruments, picked up the trumpet for a little bit. If it's something that I had kept up with, like, I feel like I would probably be a pretty good musician at this point, because it was something that I just kind of naturally was pretty good at. I have a lot of good memories from being in band and my band friends and going to concerts and competitions and things like that. So that's probably my best musical memory, my healthiest musical memory.
That's a nice memory. I appreciate you sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely appreciate you coming back on the show, Coby, and talking about your newest book and your upcoming book. And I will definitely be excited to take a look when that next one comes out too. And hopefully you can come back and tell me all about it in a future episode. So I just want to say once again, thank you. I appreciate you. And with that, I will end our call.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Bye. That was a great interview, and another big M3 thank you to Coby for taking the time again to be here with me on the show. If you haven't grabbed a copy of his books, either the Poison Path Herbal or the Poison Path Grimoire, make sure you check those out and follow the Poisoner's Apothecary on social media too. I'll put all those links in the video description below, and I'll also link his previous episode because that one was just as interesting as this. Please make sure that you like and subscribe here on YouTube. If you enjoyed this particular video, it'd be pretty cool if you left a comment saying so. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, or other social media at Eric Arcadian. And as of very recently, you can now pre-order my upcoming book on fluid condensers. So that's pretty exciting, and all those links are below. But if you really want to help support me making more content in the future, the best way to do that is to check out my Patreon page. Patrons get early access to these interviews before anyone else, plus they get some other cool benefits too. Remember, there's always a way to make music. Until next time.